Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the candlelight, pouring ourselves something vaguely drinkable, and stepping back into the Middle Ages. Not the grand halls of kings, not the solemn cathedrals, but the far messier, smellier, and frankly more honest world of the medieval tavern. So, find a comfortable spot, maybe curl under a blanket, and let's wander together into a place where spilled ale, loud dice games, and questionable moral choices blend into the soundtrack of nightly life. Because sometimes history isn't about crowns and crusades. Sometimes it's just about drunk peasants shouting at each other. Now, before we get too cozy, let's be clear. Taverns were not the same as modern pubs. They weren't cozy brick rooms with polished counters and football on TV. They were wooden, smoky, and usually sticky in ways you don't want to imagine. If you walked into one with your 21st century sensibilities, you'd probably last about 5 minutes before you started screaming about hygiene. But for medieval folks, these places were everything: a social hub, a business office, a gambling den, a concert hall, and sometimes, well, an unofficial brothel. Taverns were often licensed by the local lord or town council, which sounds very proper, but enforcement was spotty. So what you actually got was a patchwork of taverns ranging from half-decent inns for traveling merchants to glorified shacks where somebody's cousin was brewing beer in the back room with water that may or may not have corpses upstream. But hey, nobody was really picky. The important thing was it had alcohol, and medieval alcohol was the safe thing to drink. You see, people in the Middle Ages didn't exactly trust water, and to be fair, they were right. Water was a one-way ticket to dysentery. Beer and wine, even the weak small beer most people drank daily, were safer. So taverns weren't just about getting hammered, they were daily hydration stations. That's right, medieval toddlers drank more beer than modern frat boys. Just weaker beer. Let's take a little stroll inside, shall we? You push open the creaky wooden door, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Smoke, sweat, spilled ale, maybe a faint whiff of horse from the stables out back. And then your eyes adjust to the candlelight. Tables are crowded with locals, leaning in too close, voices loud, tankards clinking. Someone slamming down dice. Someone else is singing badly in the corner. And the tavern keeper? He's pretending not to notice the barmaid slipping a jug of ale under the table to her cousin without paying. Ah, yes, the tavern keeper. This was usually a man, though sometimes a woman, and their reputation varied wildly. Some were upstanding members of the community. Others were notorious cheats who watered down wine and took bets on illegal dice games. In England, the stereotype was that tavern keepers mixed chalk, resin, or even salt water into their drinks to stretch profits, which might explain why medieval hangovers were probably less, I had too much, and more, I think I'm actively dying. Of course, people didn't go to taverns just to drink. They went for the atmosphere. This was the place where news traveled. A traveling merchant passing through might spread the word of a war 3 towns away, or that the French king had a new mistress, or that your cousin down the road was arrested for stealing a pig. Taverns were basically the medieval version of Twitter, but with more spilled ale and slightly fewer conspiracy theories. Slightly. And then there was gambling. Oh, gambling was everywhere. Dice games were the most popular, though playing cards arrived in Europe by the 14th century and quickly spread through taverns. Dice, of course, were not exactly fair. Weighted dice, shaved dice, or just good old-fashioned cheating were part of the experience. The church, naturally, condemned gambling, calling it sinful, which only made people want to do it more, because nothing spices up a dice game like knowing you're simultaneously risking eternal damnation. Music, too, was a huge part of tavern life. Traveling minstrels would stop in, bringing their lutes, fiddles, or bagpipes. And no, it wasn't always graceful. Imagine a half-drunk man yelling old ballads off-key while someone bangs a drum that's barely in tune. That was your medieval concert experience. Sometimes bawdy songs, sometimes historical ballads about battles that may or may not have happened, sometimes just thinly veiled insults about the Lord's daughter. You know, quality entertainment. And then, of course, there were the fights. Because when you cram a bunch of people into a smoky room, give them strong drink, and let them gamble, someone's going to get punched. Tavern brawls were so common that towns sometimes had to create specific ordinances against them. But here's the thing. Most of these fights were not cinematic. They weren't big choreographed sword battles, more like two drunk men rolling on the floor while everyone else laughed and took bets on who would vomit first. But taverns weren't just about peasants. Nobles and clergy showed up too. In theory, monks and priests were banned from taverns. In practice, they were some of the most loyal customers. Monks weren't exactly strangers to alcohol, after all. They brewed some of the best beer in Europe. And nothing says holy devotion quite like Father Thomas trying to explain the Trinity after his fourth jug of ale. Nobles, too, enjoyed taverns when traveling. It was one of the few places where a knight and a peasant might sit under the same roof, pretending social hierarchy didn't exist, at least until the bill came. Now it's worth mentioning the women. Tavern culture had a complicated relationship with them. Officially, respectable women weren't supposed to frequent taverns. Unofficially, plenty did. Women ran taverns, worked in them, and drank in them. But there was also a strong association between taverns and sex work. Sometimes taverns doubled as brothels, with alewives or barmaids offering additional services upstairs. The line between barmaid and sex worker could be thin. And, predictably, moralists complained endlessly about the corruption of public morals, which is a nice way of saying they didn't like women having fun. Let's float a little further to the food, because yes, taverns served meals, but don't picture a fancy pub menu. Think stew, always stew, usually whatever was available, beans, onions, maybe some salted pork if you were lucky. Bread was a staple, though often stale, and cheese, because cheese survives almost anything. So if you were hungry in a tavern, you were probably eating stew, bread, and cheese. Wash it down with ale, and congratulations. You've had the medieval equivalent of fast food. So, to sum up this first glimpse, the medieval tavern was noisy, smoky, slightly dangerous, but absolutely central to community life. It wasn't just about drinking. It was about belonging. Whether you were there to gamble, gossip, eat, fight, or quietly slip into the back room with someone who wasn't your spouse, the tavern was where life actually happened after the sun went down. And now that we've set the stage, let's dive deeper into the details. Who exactly went to these taverns? What kinds of laws governed them? And how did medieval authorities try, and usually fail, to control the chaos? But we'll get to that in a moment. All right, so now that we've stepped inside the tavern and gotten a sense of the atmosphere, sticky floors, smoky rafters, and questionable stew, it's time to talk about what happened outside the tavern walls, specifically the endless stream of rules, regulations, and moral hand-wringing that authorities try to impose on these places. Because, of course, if something is popular, you can bet there's a priest, a town council, or a king somewhere trying to ruin it. Taverns were licensed businesses, in theory anyway. Local lords or town councils issued permits, sometimes for a fee, which supposedly controlled who could sell alcohol. The reasoning was partly economic. If you sold wine without a license, you weren't paying your dues to the Lord. And partly moral. Authorities liked to claim that keeping taverns regulated would reduce crime, fights, and rampant drunkenness, which is adorable, really, considering none of that actually happened. One of the most common laws was about closing times. Medieval authorities were very worried about people staying out too late. In Paris, for example, taverns were sometimes ordered to close at sunset, on the theory that nothing good ever happens after dark, which is true, but also nothing fun either. Unsurprisingly, taverns ignored this. If anything, they probably got busier after dark, once people had finished work. So, yes, medieval nightlife was technically illegal in some places, which just made it more appealing. Then there were the attempts to control pricing. England, for instance, had regulations about how much tavern keepers could charge for ale. This sounds noble, but it usually just meant that tavern owners cheated in other ways, like watering down drinks or using smaller mugs while charging full price. There's a record of one tavern keeper being punished for selling ale in short measure, which basically means customers paid for a pint and got a sad medieval half-cup instead. And let's not forget the church. Oh, the church hated taverns. Officially, priests and monks were banned from visiting them, which, of course, meant they visited them all the time. There are countless complaints in church records about clergy being spotted gambling, drinking, or, let's be honest, spending time with the tavern women. One bishop even complained that monks were skipping evening prayers because they were too busy drinking in local taverns, which feels very on brand, honestly. Moralists loved to rail against the tavern as a place of sin. Drinking was bad. Gambling was bad. Singing bawdy songs was bad. Flirting was bad. Basically, everything that made taverns fun was bad. And yet, every time the church tried to crack down, taverns just multiplied. It's almost like people enjoy ignoring sermons. Now, when authorities did decide to punish taverns, it could get dramatic. Tavern keepers who broke the law might be fined, whipped, or even have their establishments shut down. There's at least one record of a tavern being literally torn apart by angry officials. Imagine being so against someone selling beer that you show up with hammers and just demolish the place. That's medieval regulation in action. But the truth is, taverns were too useful to eliminate. They were gathering places. Soldiers were recruited in taverns. Merchants made deals in taverns. Even officials themselves needed taverns when they traveled. So, while regulations were strict on paper, in practice, they were often ignored. It was a game of appearances, cracked down enough to look moral, but not so much that people actually lost their only social outlet. Now, who exactly would you see in one of these taverns? Well, the crowd was a mix. Farmers, laborers, craftsmen, they made up the bulk of the customers. But travelers were just as common. Merchants passing through would stop for food, drink, and gossip. Pilgrims, too, often filled taverns on their way to holy shrines, which meant you could have a blacksmith, a wool merchant, and a pilgrim all drinking side by side, probably complaining about taxes. And then there were the professional troublemakers. Every tavern had them. The chronic gamblers, the men who always started fights, the women who sold more than ale. These people gave taverns their rowdy reputation. If you were a respectable town councilor, this is who you were picturing when you tried to regulate nightlife. But let's not pretend everyone else was innocent. Respectable citizens drank, they gambled, they flirted, and they did it in taverns, because that's where life was happening. In fact, many towns even had laws specifically warning apprentices and servants not to spend too much time in taverns, which only tells us one thing. Apprentices and servants spent a lot of time in taverns, because if you've just spent 12 hours making horseshoes or scrubbing floors, you're probably not rushing home for Bible study. Let's drift to another interesting detail: tavern games. Dice were the classic choice, but they weren't the only ones. People also played board games like Nine Men's Morris, which is basically medieval tic-tac-toe, but slightly more complicated. Chess, too, was popular among the more educated customers. And, of course, drinking games. The details are scarce, but we can safely assume that any time alcohol exists, humans will invent games to make it worse. Of course, all of this attracted thieves. Taverns were prime hunting grounds for pickpockets. A crowded, dimly lit room full of drunk people is basically paradise for a thief. There are even court records of entire gangs using taverns as their base of operations. One gang in London was known for meeting at the same tavern every night before heading out to rob travelers, which makes you wonder if the tavern keeper got a cut. Probably. And then there were the scandals. Every so often, taverns became the center of political or social uproar. In Florence, taverns were accused of spreading political gossip and even planning uprisings. Authorities worried that too many men gathered in one smoky room might turn from dice to rebellion, which is honestly fair. If you've ever seen 5 drunk men trying to plan something, it's usually bad news. So yes, taverns were places of joy, laughter, and community, but they were also places of suspicion, crime, and scandal. A medieval town might publicly condemn them, but privately, everyone knew you couldn't really function without them. They were the heart of social life, and no amount of moral panic could change that. Now, we've set the stage with laws, rules, and respectable disapproval. In our next drift through the tavern, let's sink into the characters themselves: the alewives, the musicians, the drunks, the fighters, the lovers, and the hangers-on who made tavern nights so endlessly unpredictable. But for now, refill your imaginary tankard and let's take a slow breath before we wade back into the crowd. So far, we've looked at the tavern itself, the smell, the noise, the rules everyone ignored. But a tavern wasn't just a building, it was the people inside it. And if you stayed long enough, you'd notice a few recurring characters. Let's start with the tavern keeper, the boss, the ringleader, the one person trying, sometimes failing, to keep order. In many towns, this was a man. But women, especially widows, often ran taverns too. They were called alewives, which sounds charming until you read medieval records complaining about them constantly. Apparently, alewives were accused of watering down drinks, short-changing customers, and generally being dishonest, which, to be fair, describes about half of all tavern keepers, male or female. But women got the brunt of the blame because, of course, they did. Alewives became stock characters in medieval satire. Literature loved to portray them as greedy, sharp-tongued women serving bad beer to gullible men. It was probably exaggerated, but it tells us something. People remembered the alewife. She wasn't just a background figure. She was central to the tavern experience. Half publican, half neighborhood gossip, half feared scolder. Yes, that's three halves. But taverns didn't really do math. Now, let's look at the drinkers themselves. There was always the drunk. Every tavern had one. He, or sometimes she, was the person who got too far gone, too fast, falling off benches, singing badly, picking fights with the furniture. Medieval literature is full of mockery about drunken fools. But they were part of the atmosphere. The drunk wasn't just tolerated, he was entertainment. If you wanted a quiet night, you stayed home. If you wanted to laugh at someone trying to juggle dice while hiccuping loudly, you went to the tavern. And then there were the gamblers. Dice players hunched over tables, slamming down bets with a suspicious glint in their eyes. They were noisy, excitable, and often very bad losers. Sometimes fights broke out, but more often the gamblers just lost all their money and ended up borrowing drinks from the alewife on credit, which, of course, they rarely paid back. Credit tabs were a huge part of tavern life. People would drink now, promise to pay later, and then not. Tavern keepers were forever chasing debts. Some towns even had court cases where alewives sued customers for unpaid tabs. Which means, yes, people were literally dragged into court because they couldn't settle their beer bill. Let's not forget the musicians. A medieval tavern without music was just a sad, smoky room. Minstrels wandered from tavern to tavern, carrying fiddles, lutes, or bagpipes. They sang ballads, love songs, or bawdy tunes about lust and drinking. Payment was usually in drinks, coins, or food. Sometimes tavern keepers hired musicians to attract crowds. Other times they just tolerated whoever showed up. The quality of music varied. You might get a talented troubadour, or you might get someone's cousin who thought hitting a drum really hard counted as rhythm. Either way, it filled the silence. And yes, taverns also attracted storytellers. Traveling entertainers who spun tales of knights, saints, or monsters. They could captivate an audience between dice games. Imagine it. The room goes quiet, ale mugs half raised, as a storyteller describes some knight slaying a dragon. And then, right as the story hits the climax, someone yells because they lost at dice, and the moment is gone. That was tavern storytelling in action. Now, let's glance over at the clergy. Officially, they weren't supposed to be here. Unofficially, they were. Monks, priests, friars, they all slipped into taverns, sometimes for a drink, sometimes for gossip, sometimes for less holy reasons. One English preacher complained bitterly that friars were more often found in taverns than in monasteries. And while it's easy to judge, let's be honest, if you were a monk stuck copying texts all day, wouldn't you sneak out for a pint, too? Of course, not everyone came to drink. Some came to sell. Taverns doubled as marketplaces. Traveling merchants used them as business hubs, meeting clients or selling goods. Prostitutes also worked taverns, quietly, or not so quietly, offering services upstairs. Sometimes they worked with the tavern keeper, sometimes independently. Either way, taverns blurred the line between public house and brothel, which only added to their scandalous reputation. Another character you'd notice was the servant or apprentice, young men sent by their masters to fetch ale. They were technically supposed to bring it back, but often they lingered. Imagine a 15-year-old boy, given money for beer, deciding to drink half of it before heading home. Records suggest this happened all the time, much to the frustration of employers, which is why so many laws specifically warned apprentices not to loiter in taverns. The fact those laws kept being repeated tells us exactly how much apprentices obeyed. And then there were the women customers, not just alewives or sex workers, but ordinary women, married women, single women, even widows. Sometimes they came with their husbands, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. Their presence was controversial. Moralists argued that taverns corrupted women, that no respectable woman should be there, which naturally meant plenty of respectable women went anyway. Because people rarely follow rules that deny them fun. Let's drift to the corner, where someone's dozing with his head on the table. Sleeping in taverns was common. Travelers who couldn't afford an inn might just pass out on a bench after too much ale. Some taverns even allowed people to rent a space to sleep, basically a shared bed in a back room. Privacy was minimal. Comfort was questionable. But if you had nowhere else to go, a tavern floor was better than the street. Finally, let's talk about the fighters, the brawlers. Not every night ended in peace. Alcohol plus gambling plus gossip was a dangerous combination. A shove, a rude comment, a lost dice game. Suddenly, two men were rolling on the floor. Sometimes knives came out, sometimes chairs. But often, it was just messy grappling until someone separated them. Fights were entertainment in themselves, unless you were the unlucky tavern keeper trying to stop two grown men from destroying your furniture. So yes, the tavern was filled with characters, cheats, gossips, gamblers, minstrels, drunks, and the occasional holy man pretending he was just passing through. Each of them added to the chaos. Each of them made tavern nights unpredictable, and together they created a social world that no law or sermon could erase. In our next slow drift, we'll linger on the entertainment itself. Music, games, jokes, and all the ways people tried to amuse themselves once the ale started flowing. Because while the tavern could be scandalous, it was also where laughter and storytelling thrived. But that's for the next part. For now, let's sit back, refill the jug, and enjoy the company of this strange little crowd. All right, we've met the characters, the alewives, the gamblers, the drunks, the occasional monk sneaking in under his hood. But what did these people do once they got inside? Because you don't just sit in a tavern for hours staring at your tankard. Well, maybe some people did. But most wanted to be entertained. Let's start with games. Dice were the undisputed kings of tavern entertainment. You could play simple betting games with 2 dice, or elaborate ones with multiple players and higher stakes. The most notorious was called hazard, which was basically the medieval equivalent of roulette. Lots of shouting, lots of losing, and almost no one actually understanding the rules. By the 14th century, authorities were so alarmed by hazard that they banned it in multiple cities, which of course guaranteed it spread faster. Nothing encourages people to gamble quite like being told it's forbidden. Then came cards. Playing cards arrived in Europe from the Islamic world around the late 14th century. They caught on fast, especially in taverns. Cards were portable, quick to learn, and perfect for gambling. Naturally, moralists complained that cards distracted men from work, encouraged vice, and led to blasphemous behavior, which again translated to people loved them. Within a century, taverns across Europe had regular card players hunched over tables, slamming down tricks, and arguing over who cheated. Spoiler, everyone cheated. For those less inclined to gamble, there were board games. 9 Men's Morris, a strategy game played with little pebbles or carved pieces, was popular. So was backgammon, or its earlier forms. Chess, too, made appearances, though that was a bit more highbrow. Imagine trying to play a calm, intellectual game of chess while someone next to you is vomiting into a bucket. That's tavern atmosphere for you. And then there were drinking games. The details are fuzzy because medieval chroniclers rarely bothered to write down the rules of who can chug the fastest, but we can safely assume they existed. One German custom involved passing a giant communal drinking bowl around the table. Each person had to drink without spilling, and whoever failed was mocked endlessly. Think of it as the ancestor of beer pong, but with less ping pong and more dysentery. Now, let's drift toward the music, because taverns were noisy not just with chatter, but with song. Traveling minstrels and musicians often performed, singing tales of knights, romances, or battles. Some played instruments like fiddles, lutes, or bagpipes. Others just sang. Payment was in food, drink, or coins tossed their way. And if the performance was bad, the audience had no problem booing or throwing scraps, medieval Yelp reviews delivered in cabbage form. But it wasn't just professionals. Ordinary tavern-goers sang too. Drinking songs, bawdy ballads, and popular tunes echoed through the rafters. Some songs were comic, others obscene, others weirdly religious for people holding tankards. Sometimes a group would break into a round, the kind of simple, repetitive song everyone could join in after a few drinks. And of course, there was always that one drunk customer who thought he was a soloist. Every tavern had him, every single one. And we can't skip storytelling. Taverns were hubs for gossip, but also for longer tales. Storytellers spun yarns about saints, kings, or local scandals. Some were wandering entertainers, others just locals with a talent for exaggeration. You might hear a dramatic account of the last battle in France, followed by an obscene joke about the miller's daughter. The mix of sacred and profane was constant, because why not talk about salvation in one breath and scandal in the next? That was tavern humor. Another form of entertainment was performance games. Wrestling matches sometimes happened right there in the tavern, with space cleared and bets placed. Occasionally, acrobats or jugglers passed through, putting on little shows. If you were really lucky, you might see a bear baiting announced at a tavern, though those usually happened outside. The point is, taverns weren't quiet. They were mini theaters of chaos. And then, of course, there were insults. Medieval people loved verbal games, mocking someone's clothes, their drinking ability, their family. It was all part of the fun. Some tavern contests were basically roasting sessions. If you couldn't trade insults, you weren't much fun at the table. And yes, plenty of fights started this way. But more often, it was just noisy banter, the kind that left everyone laughing, until someone's pride got too bruised. Now, let's be honest. Not all entertainment was wholesome. Taverns were deeply linked to sex work. A song might slide into innuendo. A back room might double as a brothel. Barmaids weren't just serving drinks. Sometimes they were part of the entertainment themselves. For authorities, this was scandalous. For customers, it was just another night out. Food, too, was part of the experience. Eating together was entertainment. You didn't just drink. You feasted on stew, bread, and cheese while you laughed at the drunk slumped under the table. Communal meals created a sense of bonding, even if the food was barely edible, which, to be clear, it usually was. So, when you think of medieval tavern nights, don't imagine quiet sipping. Imagine dice clattering, songs rising, minstrels strumming, gamblers shouting, insults flying, someone vomiting in the corner, and everyone else pretending not to notice. That was entertainment, messy, chaotic, often smelly, but for medieval people, utterly irresistible. In the next drift, we'll look at taverns as networks, not just social fun, but political gossip, shady deals, and even full-blown conspiracies hatched over ale. Because when people gather in numbers, things happen, sometimes revolutionary, sometimes ridiculous. But for now, let's lean back, let the lute strum fade, and imagine the warmth of the fire, the clatter of dice, and the buzz of drunken voices filling the night. So far, we've talked about taverns as noisy, smoky playgrounds of dice, stew, and bad singing. But there's another layer. Taverns weren't just about fun. They were also about information. And in a world without newspapers, coffee shops, or Instagram stories, taverns were where the news happened. Picture it, a room full of travelers, merchants, locals, and the occasional wandering monk who pretended he was just passing through. Everyone brought stories, some true, some wildly exaggerated, some made up on the spot because they sounded good. Gossip flowed as freely as the ale. If you wanted to know what was happening 2 towns over or 2 kingdoms over, the tavern was your newsroom. This was especially true for political gossip. Tavern chatter often focused on kings, queens, and local lords. People speculated about wars, complained about taxes, mocked their rulers, and swapped rumors about court scandals. You might hear that the king had a new mistress, or that your neighbor's son was conscripted into an army, or that some poor knight lost half his teeth in a jousting match. All of it filtered through the ale-fogged atmosphere. Authorities were not thrilled about this. Governments knew taverns were breeding grounds for political grumbling. In Florence, authorities accused taverns of spreading sedition. In England, tavern keepers were sometimes pressured to report suspicious conversations. And in France, taverns were even described as schools of treason, which is dramatic, but not entirely wrong. When enough drunk men complain about the tax collector in the same smoky room, suddenly someone has the bright idea of chasing him out of town. Let's float over to the conspiratorial side. Taverns were natural places for secret or not-so-secret meetings. Rebellions, uprisings, and strikes were often hatched in taverns. When peasants in England planned revolts, they didn't gather in churches to whisper. They gathered in taverns over ale where they felt free to speak. The peasants' revolt of 1381, for instance, owed much to tavern talk. Leaders spread their message in drinking houses, riling up supporters 1 tankard at a time. Guilds and workers also used taverns as meeting halls. If you were a group of carpenters or weavers and you wanted to discuss wages or organize a strike, where else would you go? The tavern was your boardroom. Records show that guilds regularly met in taverns, blurring the line between social drinking and collective bargaining. Imagine a medieval workers' union meeting, but with more ale and fewer minutes recorded. Merchants, too, struck deals in taverns. You might see 2 wool traders haggling over prices at one table while gamblers shouted at dice at the next. Inns with taverns attached were especially important for long-distance traders. These spaces became makeshift offices where contracts were signed and goods exchanged. If you think of a tavern as only a place of chaos, remember that medieval business was often conducted with a mug of ale in hand. And then there were spies. Yes, taverns attracted them. Kings and nobles sometimes sent agents into taverns to listen for gossip or detect plots. It was the medieval version of intelligence gathering. A good spy didn't need to sneak into the castle. He just needed to sit quietly in a tavern and listen to drunk men talk too much, which frankly was not difficult. But the tavern's political role wasn't just about treason, it was also about community. Local disputes were argued and sometimes resolved in taverns. Feuds between neighbors might be hashed out over ale. Local officials sometimes used taverns as places to post announcements or hold informal meetings. In some cases, taverns even functioned as temporary courtrooms, justice delivered between mugs of beer. Of course, not all tavern gossip was useful. Much of it was nonsense. Rumors spread like wildfire. A story about a plague 2 towns over could grow into a tale about demons attacking the countryside. A minor tax increase could morph into a rumor that the king was selling peasants to the Turks. The line between fact and fiction was fluid, and taverns didn't exactly encourage sober analysis. Still, the tavern was where voices were heard. Ordinary people who had little influence in official politics could at least complain loudly in taverns. They could share stories, spread rumors, and sometimes, rarely, turn those words into action. The authorities may have sneered at taverns as dens of vice, but they couldn't deny their importance. If you wanted to understand the mood of the people, you didn't go to church. You went to the tavern. Now, let's not over-romanticize this. Most tavern talk didn't lead to revolution. It led to hangovers. But every so often, those smoky conversations mattered. They shaped public opinion, forged alliances, or sparked unrest. The tavern was both trivial and powerful, full of nonsense, but also full of possibility. And of course, for many people, the gossip was entertainment in itself. Who needs a traveling minstrel when you can hear the blacksmith rant about his landlord, or the miller exaggerate his latest fishing trip, or the widow down the road whisper about who was seen sneaking into whose house? Taverns were not just about drinking together. They were about knowing together. Knowing who was cheating, who was rising, who was falling, and who was just embarrassing themselves in public. So yes, taverns were messy, smelly, and scandalous. But they were also newsrooms, union halls, spy dens, and rumor factories. They were where people figured out what was happening in the world, or at least what they thought was happening. In our next drift, we'll step outside the tavern walls, because the tavern wasn't just an isolated box of chaos. It was part of the wider town. We'll look at its place in medieval streets, its connection to markets, churches, and guild halls, and how it fit into the rhythm of everyday life. But for now, let's stay seated at the table, listening to the gossip flow as freely as the ale, knowing that half of it is probably wrong, but enjoying it anyway. By now, we've been sitting at the table long enough to smell of smoke, ale, and onions. Let's stretch a little, step outside the tavern door, because the tavern was never just a sealed-off room of noise. It was a part of the medieval town, woven into its rhythm. Imagine a small market square, stalls of vegetables, cloth, and salted fish, chickens wandering around like they own the place, a church steeple rising over the rooftops, and tucked into the corner, with a crooked wooden sign swinging in the breeze, sits the tavern. Always close to the action, never far from where people gathered. Taverns and markets went hand in hand. A busy market day meant a busy tavern. Traders, farmers, and townsfolk all needed somewhere to warm up, rest their legs, and drink away the memory of haggling over onions. Deals made in the market often carried straight into the tavern, sealed not with signatures, but with a round of ale. In that sense, taverns weren't just near the economy. They were part of it. Proximity to churches was also common. which sounds ironic. Holy worship one moment, drunken dice games the next. But people didn't separate sacred and profane spaces the way we might. Taverns were often just down the street from churches or monasteries. Pilgrims leaving a shrine might head directly into a tavern to drink, eat, and brag about their relic collecting adventure. Medieval moralists hated this, of course. They grumbled that people exited Mass and went straight to the tavern, which honestly sounds accurate. Taverns also blended into the cycle of festivals. A feast day meant processions, music, and celebration. And after the holy part of the day was done, where did people gather? Right, taverns filled up. On Carnival, or during a saint's feast, taverns became extensions of the festival itself. Singing, masks, dancing, sometimes even mock parades spilling from tavern doors into the streets. It blurred the line between religious ritual and street party. In bigger towns and cities, taverns multiplied. Streets might have several, ranging from dingy alehouses to more respectable inns with tavern rooms. The placement wasn't random. They clustered near busy routes, bridges, gates, or crossroads where travelers passed. Inns and taverns near city gates were like welcome mats. First stop for a drink, last stop before leaving. If you wanted to find strangers, those were the places to be. And speaking of strangers, taverns were central to pilgrimage culture. Medieval Europe was obsessed with pilgrimages. People traveled to shrines, relics, and holy sites, and they needed food and drink on the way. Pilgrim routes were lined with taverns, often right near hostels or inns. Taverns became mini pilgrim stations, places where travelers shared stories of their journeys, compared relic badges, and swapped exaggerated tales about miracles they definitely witnessed. Imagine a tavern full of tired, blistered pilgrims showing off seashell badges from Santiago while drinking ale that tasted like feet. That was reality. But taverns weren't just for special days or travel. They were part of the everyday rhythm. In towns, taverns often opened from morning until late at night. Morning drinking wasn't unusual. Workers sometimes started their day with a small beer, since water wasn't always safe and ale gave energy. At midday, you might see clerks and artisans slipping into a tavern for a quick drink. By evening, crowds grew larger, merchants after work, guild members meeting, travelers finding lodging, and locals gossiping. So the tavern was a clock of its own. It mirrored the pulse of the town. Quiet in the morning, bustling in the evening, rowdy at night. For many townsfolk, daily life was measured not just by the church bells, but by tavern hours. And this rhythm was so natural that authorities sometimes relied on taverns for official business. Local courts occasionally met there. Decrees were read out there. Lost and found notices might be posted on tavern doors. Imagine hearing about a new tax, a runaway servant, and a missing cow while leaning on the tavern counter. Civic announcements with ale in hand. Now let's not forget villages. Taverns there were even more central. In small communities with fewer buildings, the tavern often stood right on the main road, sometimes doubling as the village hall. In places without big guild halls or marketplaces, the tavern was the social hub. Weddings spilled into it, disputes were settled in it, and sometimes the entire village crowded in to drink together after harvest. It's easy to see taverns as detached little worlds of drunken chaos, but in reality, they were fully woven into the town's body. They linked to markets, festivals, pilgrimages, guilds, courts, and family life. They were nodes of connection, humming with the energy of the community. And while moralists groaned about vice and laziness, they knew taverns weren't going anywhere. Shut down a tavern, and the town itself lost something. A rhythm, a meeting place, a living room that belonged to everyone. So, as we drift along, let's picture the tavern not as a lonely building, but as part of a busy medieval street. Chickens underfoot, merchants shouting, church bells ringing, pilgrims passing, and in the middle of it all, a doorway spilling light, noise, and the smell of ale into the town square. In our next stretch, we'll sink back inside, this time into the people themselves, the owners, the staff, and the regulars who gave the tavern its character. Because a tavern was never just wood and ale. It was the people who ran it, and the people who kept stumbling back in. So far, we've seen taverns as noisy hubs of food, drink, gossip, and occasional conspiracy. But who actually ran the place? Who kept the ale flowing, the stew bubbling, and the dice rattling across the table? And who were the folks who showed up night after night, shaping the tavern's personality just as much as its crooked beams and smoky rafters? Let's start with the tavern keeper. The medieval tavern was usually a family business. Tavern keepers were often married couples, sometimes widows, sometimes entire households who lived above the tavern itself. That meant when you walked into a tavern, you weren't just entering a public drinking house. You were also walking into someone's home. Cozy, yes, but also awkward. Imagine staggering around drunk while the tavern keeper's children are upstairs trying to sleep. Tavern keepers had reputations that were mixed. On the one hand, they were essential. They kept the town watered, or rather, beered. They offered food, lodging, and a social space. On the other hand, they were often accused of cheating, watering down ale, or charging too much. Authorities routinely inspected taverns for fraud, checking that the ale was the right strength and sold in the right measure. There were even official ale tasters, yes, that was a real job, whose duty was to make sure tavern keepers weren't scamming their customers. One wonders how many ale tasters conveniently missed violations after a free round. Female tavern keepers were especially common. Widows often kept taverns after their husbands died, making the business a source of independence. Some moralists, of course, fretted about women running taverns, as if a woman with a beer jug was somehow more dangerous than a man. But in practice, women kept taverns running across Europe. They were cooks, servers, bookkeepers, and sometimes bouncers when things got rowdy. Now, taverns didn't always have a lot of staff. Smaller ones might just be the family. Bigger ones had serving boys or girls, basically medieval waiters. Their job was to run tankards back and forth, wipe down tables, and occasionally dodge being grabbed by drunk patrons. Not exactly a glamorous career. In larger inns with taverns, staff might also tend stables, carry luggage, and prepare rooms. Taverns were workhouses of endless chores, and the workers didn't exactly go home smelling fresh. Cooks were crucial too. Tavern food wasn't fine dining, but someone had to keep the pot of stew simmering and the bread baked. In many taverns, the cook was also the tavern keeper's wife, which meant complaints about the food were unwise. And of course there was security. Tavern keepers sometimes hired strong men to keep order, especially in cities where things got rowdy. But often they relied on regulars to enforce the mood. A tavern's character came from its people, and every tavern had its cast of regulars. Let's meet a few of them. There was the local drunk. Everyone knew him. He had a favorite seat, a predictable story he told over and over, and a knack for falling asleep mid-sentence. He was both annoying and beloved, a living piece of furniture. Then there was the gambler, dice in hand, always looking for a game, often broke, sometimes suspiciously lucky. Gamblers added spice to taverns, but also tension. More than one fight started when a gambler's luck was questioned. Next, the loud storyteller, half entertainer, half liar. He exaggerated his adventures. Every fishing trip was epic. Every brawl was legendary. Every journey more dangerous than the last. People rolled their eyes but secretly enjoyed the tales. In a world without Netflix, a good liar was a form of public entertainment. We can't forget the clerk or student, the one who fancied himself intellectual. He quoted Latin, bragged about books he'd half read, and occasionally passed out in a corner after 2 mugs of strong ale. Medieval taverns had plenty of them, especially in university towns like Paris or Oxford. Drunk students were such a menace that they inspired entire comedies. And then there were the travelers, merchants, pilgrims, wandering monks. They added fresh gossip and new stories to the mix. Sometimes they were welcomed, sometimes they were mocked, but they gave taverns a sense of the wider world. Each regular helped define a tavern. A tavern full of gamblers felt different from one full of pilgrims. A tavern known for students had a different energy from one full of laborers. And tavern keepers had to manage them all, keeping the peace just enough to avoid disaster, but not so much that the fun stopped. Regulars weren't always harmless, of course. Taverns could attract thieves, con men, and sex workers. The line between a tavern and a brothel was often thin. Some taverns officially doubled as brothels. Others just tolerated the overlap. This gave taverns a reputation for vice, which made them popular with customers, but hated by preachers. And let's not forget musicians. Every tavern needed someone to strum, drum, or sing badly. Sometimes this was a paid minstrel, sometimes just a drunk customer banging on the table. Music was as essential as ale in creating the tavern's mood. Without it, things felt too quiet, too bare. So when we imagine a medieval tavern, it's not just a room with drinks. It's a living ecosystem of personalities: the tired cook, the harried server, the suspicious gambler, the brash storyteller, the sleepy drunk, the wandering pilgrim, the tavern keeper hovering behind the counter, trying to make a living while keeping chaos just barely contained. This mixture of staff and regulars made taverns unpredictable, and that was the point. No 2 nights were the same. You never knew if you'd get a peaceful evening of quiet drinking, or a brawl that ended with someone being dragged into the street. And for many people, that uncertainty was part of the draw. As we drift further, let's stay with the people. Because taverns weren't just about drinking, they were about relationships. Friendships, rivalries, romances, and grudges all simmered under the smoky roof. In our next part, we'll explore those human connections, how taverns brought people together, sometimes for life, sometimes just until the ale ran out. We've seen how taverns looked, smelled, and functioned. We've met the keepers, the cooks, the dice-shaking gamblers, and the ever-present local drunk who basically counted as furniture. But what really gave a tavern its soul wasn't the ale or the stew. It was the people and the strange, shifting relationships they built there. Let's start with friendships. Taverns were where bonds were formed, tested, and occasionally shattered by too much drink. Workers who toiled together all day often drank together at night. Guild members made the tavern their unofficial clubhouse. Soldiers bonded over mugs of beer before marching out to wars they didn't particularly want to fight. Drinking together created trust, or at least the illusion of it. There's a reason medieval chroniclers often described allies drinking together. Sharing a jug of ale was a form of sealing loyalty. It wasn't just refreshment, it was a ritual. If someone drank with you, it meant you were companions, at least for the night. Of course, it also meant you might both stumble into the gutter afterward, but solidarity is solidarity. Friendships formed in taverns could be surprisingly durable. The tavern was a neutral ground, a place where people who might not mingle elsewhere could sit at the same bench. A merchant and a craftsman, a pilgrim and a local farmer, even a student and a soldier, people who lived very different lives, might end up clinking mugs. For a few hours, social lines blurred, not completely, but enough to matter. Now, let's glide into romance. Taverns were notorious for sparking love affairs, or at least temporary arrangements. A glance across the table, a shared song, a mug passed from one hand to another. Small gestures could become the beginning of something. Medieval ballads are full of tavern love stories, sometimes sweet, sometimes messy. Of course, not all romance was poetic. Taverns were also hotspots for quick hookups, both consensual and commercial. Sex workers often worked in or around taverns, making them a common sight for what moralists scolded as sins of the flesh. The line between flirtation, romance, and transaction was sometimes hard to see. That's probably why taverns so often made churchmen nervous. Still, tavern romances had their role in everyday life. Weddings and betrothals were often celebrated in taverns, with whole families packing the hall for feasts, dancing, and, inevitably, drunken uncles embarrassing themselves. Taverns weren't just the site of scandal, they were also the site of family milestones. And then there were rivalries. Friendships could sour quickly under the influence of too much ale. Dice games went wrong. Someone cheated at cards. Someone sang too loudly. Or, as records show time and again, someone insulted someone else's hat. Yes, fights over hats were a thing. In a world where fashion was tied to honor, a hat was no small matter. Tavern rivalries often turned physical. Brawls were common, sometimes involving fists, sometimes knives, occasionally furniture. But these weren't always deadly. More often, they were noisy flares of temper that ended with someone being dragged outside to sleep it off. Think less Game of Thrones massacre, more sloppy medieval WWE. Long-term rivalries also brewed in taverns. Neighbors who already hated each other found new reasons to argue. Guild disputes spilled over into tavern tables. Sometimes taverns became the battlegrounds of simmering grudges, with everyone else forced to watch or pretend not to. But tavern bonds weren't just personal, they were communal. A tavern could act as a surrogate family for the lonely or the displaced. Regulars looked out for each other in their own rough way. A sick patron might find food delivered to him. A widow might rely on tavern friends for support. A traveler might discover unexpected hospitality from strangers who became companions for a night. At the same time, taverns could also exclude. Outsiders weren't always welcomed, especially in tight-knit villages. A stranger entering a rural tavern might face suspicious looks, higher prices, or even hostility. Taverns created bonds, but those bonds could also draw lines. You belonged, or you didn't. So the tavern was a place of paradox. It brought people together, yet also pulled them apart. It nurtured friendships, sparked romances, fueled rivalries, and cemented communities. It was messy, contradictory, and alive. And perhaps that was its secret. The tavern was where human relationships unfolded in raw, unfiltered form. The good, the bad, the tender, and the absurd, all of it under one smoky roof. As we drift onward, Let's follow those relationships outward, into culture itself. Because taverns weren't just places where bonds were made. They were places where music, stories, jokes, and traditions flourished. They were engines of culture, shaping medieval entertainment in ways far more lasting than most of their patrons ever imagined. We've wandered through smoky rooms, listened to dice clatter, watched suspiciously watery ale being poured, and survived the occasional brawl over someone's hat. Now let's float into the last layer of tavern life, the entertainment. Not just music or dice, but the cultural glue that made the tavern more than a place to drink. Because a tavern wasn't just a room where people escaped their lives. It was where culture was created, traded, and reshaped. Let's start with music. Every tavern had some, maybe not professional, maybe not good, but always there. Wandering minstrels and jongleurs perform for coin or food, strumming lutes, fiddles, or just singing loudly enough to drown out the sound of clinking mugs. Some were surprisingly talented, bringing ballads and news from distant towns. Others, let's just say they had enthusiasm, if not pitch. But tavern music wasn't limited to professionals. Customers sang loudly and badly. Drinking songs were a medieval staple, often improvised or endlessly recycled. The point wasn't quality. The point was community. When everyone shouted the same chorus, even off-key, it felt like belonging. A room full of voices in the smoky dark, weaving a temporary choir. Stories were just as important. Storytellers ranged from wandering bards to local show-offs who couldn't resist embellishing every fishing trip into an epic saga. Taverns were oral culture factories, epic tales, moral fables, scandalous gossip, and bawdy jokes all passed through their smoky air. A lot of what we think of as folklore was kept alive in these settings. Jokes, too, thrived here. Medieval humor was often crude, pun-heavy, and physical. Think fart jokes, pratfalls, and endless double entendres. If you've ever heard a bad pub joke that made you groan, congratulations, you're continuing an 800-year-old tradition. Games we've already touched on, but it's worth noting again. Dice and cards weren't just pastimes. They were part of tavern culture, shaping language, idioms, and even moral sermons. Preachers used gambling metaphors constantly, warning that life itself was like a dice game, stacked against sinners. Of course, their parishioners usually heard this right after losing money at dice the night before. But tavern entertainment wasn't only for laughter. It was a mirror. Songs and stories carried political satire, mocking lords or kings in ways you couldn't in public squares. Jokes masked critiques. Ballads remembered heroes or villains. Gossip wove itself into legend. And slowly, through ale-soaked repetition, taverns shaped how people understood their world. Universities noticed this. Students drank, sang, and wrote poetry in taverns, creating a whole subculture of ribald Latin drinking songs. The famous Carmina Burana manuscript, the one that later gave us that dramatic O Fortuna chorus, includes tavern songs about drinking, gambling, and love. These weren't just bar tunes. They became literature. Even religion seeped into tavern culture. Pilgrims swapped miracle tales over mugs. Minstrels sang songs of saints alongside bawdy ones. Priests complained that sermons couldn't compete with tavern jokes. But in a way, the tavern was preaching too. It taught lessons through laughter about fate, luck, love, and survival. The tavern was, in short, the medieval living room of culture. Songs, stories, jokes, rituals all flowed in and out of its doors. If you want to know what ordinary medieval people thought, felt, and laughed about, you won't find it in royal chronicles. You'll find it in the half-forgotten echoes of tavern chatter. And that's what makes these smoky, noisy, slightly smelly spaces so fascinating. They were not glamorous, they were not respectable, but they were human. They carried the weight of friendships, romances, rivalries, politics, gossip, and culture. They were the heartbeat of medieval nights. So tonight, as we finally drain the last mug and step out into the cool dark of a medieval street, let's remember that the tavern was never just a place to drink. It was a place to live, messy, loud, fragile, but alive. A reminder that history isn't only carved in stone or written in parchment. Sometimes it's sung badly over ale, whispered in gossip, or rolled on the luck of a dice. And with that, we let the tavern door close behind us. The light fades, the voices soften, and the night carries us on.